pay attention to who you identify with in the Bible? I know I do. In almost every story, there's somebody I kind of glom onto, and that's the person I'm going to focus on. And one of my favorite parables is the parable of the prodigal son. Most of you probably know this one. It's the story about the young man who ran away and squandered his inheritance. But when he returned home in shame, he is forgiven and extravagantly welcomed by his father. And it's a wonderful story. But when I read that parable, I usually find that all my sympathies are with the resentful older son who's saying, ugh, look at my spendthrift younger brother running away and wasting all that money and breaking my dad's heart. And meanwhile, I worked hard. I tried to do the right thing. And he's the one who gets the big party and the fatted calf. So the parable of the talents is hard for me because just like I identify with the elder son, I identify with the third servant, the one who took the talent and buried it in the ground. Because just like the elder son, he's not a risk taker. He's not someone who colors outside of the lines. He's the careful one, and I am too, so I'm okay with that. So I feel bad for the third servant. When he wasn't sure what to do, he literally did the most prudent thing imaginable. He buried the money, so he knew it would be safe. And when his master returned, he gave it back in full. He didn't run off and gamble it away or waste it on big parties or try his hand at embezzlement. He gave every cent of it back safe and sound. And for that, he gets thrown into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I mean, what? What did he do wrong? So I had to sit with this parable this week. And as I sat with it, I started thinking about the other characters in this story, and especially the master. I don't know if you noticed this, but we don't actually learn much of anything about the master at the beginning of the parable, just that he's a man who went on a journey and left his servants with money. That's it. There's no description of him beyond that until the very end of the parable, when the third servant claims that he's a harsh man who reaps where he didn't sow and gathers where he didn't scatter. And he says that's why he didn't do anything, because he was afraid. But if the servant is looking at his master with eyes of fear, then maybe he isn't seeing clearly. In fact, I think that if we put his description aside and look at what the master actually says and does, we see him in a different light. So, what can we say about the master? Well, first, he is extraordinarily rich. They say that in the ancient world, a talent was worth about 15 years of wages for an ordinary laborer. So by giving 5 talents and 2 talents and 1 talent, the master has just given his slaves 120 years worth of wages. At the very least, we are looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. And furthermore, we can see that all that money isn't even a significant amount to him. Remember, when he comes back and 2 of his slaves have doubled his money, he says, "You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." All that money, years and years worth of wages, and to him, that's just a few things. And he knows who his servants are, and he knows their capabilities. The parable doesn't say, well, he gave them all the same amount because he had so many slaves, he barely knew who was who. No, it says he gave the one 5 and the next 2 and the final one 1, each according to his ability. So this isn't a test that they're being set up to fail. He knows their abilities. He knows what they can do. He knows they can succeed. And he wants to give them the opportunity to do what they want to do, to succeed with what he has entrusted to them. And he doesn't just know them, he trusts them. He gives them the money, and then he goes away and leaves all the decisions in their hands. He doesn't give them detailed instructions. He trusts their loyalty to him, and he trusts their intelligence and their judgment. So, a traditional reading of this parable suggests that the master is Jesus himself. And that makes sense to me. The idea is that the master was present with the servants in the same way that Jesus was present in a real and physical way 2,000 years ago. But we no longer see him in that physical way. To some extent, it seems to us that he has gone away. So now we, like the servants in the parable, are living in an in-between time as we await his return. When Jesus returns, what do we think that'll be like? Do we look for that return with hope or with fear? Well, obviously, if we're the third servant, we're waiting in fear. But if we look with the eyes of the first two servants, we're able to choose hope. We can say that we've been given an opportunity to take what he has given us and build something. After all, we've been given everything we have, even our very lives, and placed in our particular place and time with our friends and our families and our communities and our problems. And Jesus, the master of the parable, says, hopefully, look around. Look at all the opportunities. What are you going to do? So I don't think the master is waiting to condemn. I think he's giving his servants a chance to see what they can do, to exercise their skills, to exercise their creativity, and to try to make something worthwhile. And I don't think that I'm just making things up here, because I think that this reading lines up with what we see in the Gospels. When we look at Jesus in the Gospels, we don't see somebody who habitually condemns or terrifies or micromanages his followers. Jesus surrounds himself with ordinary people, teaching them and guiding them and forgiving them when they get it wrong. But just like the master in the parable, he eventually gives his disciples a huge responsibility. He says, okay, now it's your turn. I've taught you what you need to know. So go out into the world and love one another, teach and heal and care for people, spread the good news to all the earth. And given this massive responsibility, did the disciples ever make a decision that proved to be a mistake or take a risk that didn't pay off? Of course they did. Even while Jesus was still with them, they made mistakes all the time. James and John think it would be a great idea to call down fire on Samaritans. Peter denies Jesus. Almost everybody runs away from the cross. But if you read Acts and the letters of Paul, you also see that his disciples also took the chances they had. They took a message of God's love and forgiveness into the world, and they built church communities where they welcomed the poor and the widows and the orphans, and they reached out to spread the good news to people who had never heard it before. So, if Jesus, the master, is all about opportunity and growth and creativity, why is this parable so hard? I think part of what makes this parable hard is that we get hung up on the metaphor. We get hung up on the language of money and profit. And we have a lot of fears about money, a lot of anxiety about money. I know that if you handed me a big chunk of money and said, okay, now go off and double it, I wouldn't even know where to start. What investments would be best? Should I put the money in the bank? Should I open up an IRA? Should I buy stocks? What if the stock market tanks? There's too much I don't know and too many ways it could go wrong. And maybe that's where the third servant is. He's afraid of the too many ways it could go wrong. But while knowing how to maximize your profits may be difficult, it's not so hard to know what God asks of us. God isn't asking us to guess whether Apple or Zoom is going to be the better investment in 5 years. I can't tell you what stocks to buy, but what investments will bear fruit in God's kingdom? That's not a mystery. God wants us to love God and love one another, to care for those in need, to love mercy, to act for justice. And the talents that we've been given often aren't monetary. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. They can be kindness, generosity, intelligence, responsibility, patience, enthusiasm, creativity, hope. These are all gifts from God. And if we decide to use them to love God and our neighbor, it's hard to think how we could go wrong. honestly, this pandemic has finally brought into focus for me the mistake that the third servant makes. Because this pandemic has forced narrower circumstances on all of us. If we want to keep ourselves and others safe, we have to be careful. We need to stay home and wear masks and try to stay away from other people as much as we can. And under these circumstances, that's the best choice. We show love for our neighbors by not spreading a deadly disease. But these narrower circumstances that we've been forced to are chosen by the third servant. He chooses to limit his horizons, to say that he can't act, when of course he actually could. And he thinks that this failure to act is the best choice. Because here's the thing. I've actually been very, very careful during this whole thing. And I suppose if I wanted to act like the third servant, I could try to put a positive spin on it. I could say, well, maybe being at home 24/7 has kept me from all kinds of sins. I am keeping my soul pure and unstained. I can hardly rob a bank or commit adultery or beat somebody up if I'm afraid to get within 10 feet of anyone. Clearly, this is the best way to live. Even when the pandemic is over, I'm going to continue to cut myself off so that I can be sure not to commit any sins. But I think we all know that that would be a very strange way to look at things. The Christian life isn't just about avoiding sin, although that's certainly a good idea. It's also about taking what we have been given, thinking, making decisions, and acting as we can to build God's kingdom. And what I've seen in the church in the past 6 months or so has been much more the response of the first two servants. The first two servants who took the risk, who went out and acted. None of us can make the pandemic go away, but I've seen so many people who look at these terrible circumstances and say, what have I been given? What can I do? How can I help? Because our actions matter. God is asking us to give of what we have, to donate to the food bank, to make masks if you know how to do that, or at least to wear a mask to the grocery store, to reach out to the lonely. If your house is crowded and tempers are short, to try to forgive, to hold back the angry retort and say something gentle instead. And I've been looking at what churches are doing during this time. Thousands and thousands of online services and Bible studies and book groups. I know a priest in South Dakota who has been live streaming evening prayer every single day since all of this started. And that's gathered a congregation across the country. And churches are reaching out to provide meals to shut-ins and childcare to hospital workers and hand sanitizer to homeless shelters. And I know that you're doing the same. At St. James, you've been holding your weekly vigil and setting up phone trees and planning new kinds of services. You've welcomed me into your community and I didn't know you before this. All of this is God's servant saying in 100 different ways, okay, I can't solve this problem, but what can I do to help? What can I do with what I have? We know that we are made in the image of God. And God is not a God who buries talents or just waits around. God is a God who acts. God is always creating and reaching out and renewing and loving. And we're called to do that too. So let us imitate the first two servants who saw the opportunities before them and took them, so that when we someday meet Jesus face to face, we can tell him with joy and excitement everything that we tried to do, both the successes and the failures. And may we then hear, you have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come, share my joy.